4:11 a.m. A jagged, nameless ridge in the Hindu Kush. The air is thin, cold, and tastes like old dust. A reconnaissance team watches the supply route below, hidden in the gray shadows of the Afghan night. Suddenly, the world turns white. A massive explosion rips through the sniper's nest. Fire and rock shards scream across the ridge. Static fills the radio. Then a frantic voice breaks through the chaos. "Sniper position lost. I repeat, Cole is gone." The team retreats, leaving behind the smoke. They believe the fire took her, but as dawn breaks, a shadow moves on the ridge. She is returning from hell. The mission was simple, but in the mountains of Afghanistan, simple is a lie. The objective was to observe a known insurgent supply route, Route Crimson. The terrain was a vertical nightmare of crumbling shale and sun-bleached limestone, where every step sent a cascade of noise echoing down the valley. The team consisted of 6 soldiers, mostly rangers, men who lived for the fast, loud, and aggressive side of war. They were built for the kinetic, for the high-decibel breach, for the split-second moment the trigger is pulled and the world erupts into chaos. And then there was Staff Sergeant Maya Cole, a sniper, a ghost in a ghillie suit that blended so perfectly into the jagged limestone of the high-altitude desert that she seemed to vanish whenever she stopped moving. In the high-stress environment of a recon team, Maya was an outlier. She didn't talk much, her voice a rare commodity saved only for mission-critical data. She didn't join in the loud, ribald jokes at the forward operating base, and she didn't boast about her confirmed count. While the others cleaned their carbines with a frantic, restless energy, the rhythmic clack-clack of bolts being cycled filling the air, Maya sat in a corner, motionless, staring at wind charts and complex ballistic tables. She was calculating variables that the others didn't even know existed. Humidity, barometric pressure, the Coriolis effect, and the subtle valley breeze that could push a bullet 3 inches off target at 800 yards. To the newer members of the team, like Specialist Miller, Maya was a mystery, or worse, a liability. Miller was young, barely 21, with a chest full of bravado and a mind shaped by recruitment videos. He saw warfare as a series of highlights, explosions, rappelling from helicopters, and heroic charges. To him, if you weren't moving, you weren't winning. "I don't get it," Miller had whispered to Sergeant Harris as they hiked the grueling 4,000-foot incline under the crushing weight of 80-pound rucks. The air was getting thinner with every yard, making their lungs burn like they were breathing glass. "She just lies there. We're doing the heavy lifting, carrying the gear, pulling security, sweating through our fatigues until they're stiff with salt, and she just waits. It must be the easiest job in the Army. Just lying in the shade while we bleed for the mission. Feels like we're carrying dead weight." Harris, a veteran of 4 tours whose face was a map of scars and sun damage, didn't correct him immediately. He watched Maya ahead of them, her movements fluid and efficient. Not a single calorie of energy wasted on unnecessary motion. "Wait until the night, Miller," Harris said, his voice low and gravelly. "Silence isn't laziness. Waiting is a skill more difficult than any firefight. It requires a kind of discipline that most men can't find in their hearts. When the world is screaming at you to run or fight, staying perfectly still is the hardest thing you'll ever do." But to a young soldier looking for action, Maya Cole looked like a quiet professional who didn't contribute enough. Maya heard the comments. She heard the snickering when she spent 6 hours meticulously adjusting the individual strands of burlap and local vegetation on her rifle. She felt the eyes on her back when she chose to eat her MREs in absolute silence, rather than join the campfire chatter. But she didn't react. Reaction is noise. Noise is heat. And in the mountains, heat gets people killed. On the 3rd night of the watch, the ridge felt different. The air was too still, an unnatural vacuum that seemed to suck the sound out of the environment. The usual nocturnal whispers of the wind through the crags had died down, leaving an oppressive, heavy silence. Maya was in her nest, a small crevice of rock 300 meters away from the main team's rallying point. Her thermal optic was swept across the valley, looking for the heat signatures of the enemy. The world through her lens was a ghost landscape of black and white. the cold stone appearing as deep obsidian and the faint residual heat of a dying day glowing like embers. She was the first to see it, not a person, but a faint, rhythmic, blinking light on a drone, a suicide bird. It was low, hugging the jagged terrain, using the shadows of the rocks to avoid radar signatures. It was moving fast, aimed straight at the heat bloom of their observation post. "Team, this is 1-6, Maya whispered into her comms, her voice as steady and cold as the limestone she rested on. "We have an inbound drone, low and fast. Suicide bird. Intercept path. 320. Get down, now." She never finished the sentence. The drone struck the rock face just 3 feet above her head. The blast was deafening, a roar of white noise that shattered the silence of the Hindu Kush. It wasn't just the fire, it was the pressure wave, a physical wall of air that slammed into her chest, knocking the air from her lungs and blacking out her vision. Rocks the size of fists rained down, pulverized into shrapnel by the shaped charge. Dust, thick and gray, choked the sky, turning the moonlight into a murky, suffocating fog that smelled of burnt plastic and pulverized granite. From the team's position, it looked like the entire ridge had collapsed into a fireball. Miller watched through his night vision, his mouth hanging open in horror. The orange bloom of the explosion was a jagged scar against the night, a funeral pyre in the sky. "Cole's gone," he shouted over the radio, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp grief. "The nest is a crater. Harris, the whole ridge just went up. There's nothing left." Harris didn't hesitate. He knew the protocol. The explosion had lit up the ridge like a beacon for every insurgent within 10 miles. The enemy would be coming to inspect their kill and clean up the survivors. "Retreat to the secondary rally point. We can't confirm status, and we're exposed. Move! Move! Leave the gear!" They left the ridge behind. They left the smoke. And in the heart of the team, there was a heavy, cold feeling. They had lost their eyes in the dark. As they scrambled down the reverse slope, their boots sliding on the loose shale, Miller kept looking back, hoping to see a silhouette following them through the haze. But there was nothing. They believed Maya Cole had died in a fire that no one could survive. To Miller, the quiet ghost of the ridge was gone, and with her, the only reason they had to keep watching the road. If you think quiet professionals are often underestimated, type unfair. Maya Cole wasn't dead, but for a long, agonizing hour, she wished she were. The blast had thrown her backward into a narrow vertical fissure in the rock, a geographical fluke that saved her life while nearly crushing her ribs. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched metallic scream that drowned out the world, a sound like a million cicadas. Her uniform was torn into rags, her skin peppered with gravel, and the searing heat of the lithium batteries from the drone. And her radio was dead. Smashed against the granite, its internal circuits fused into a useless lump of plastic and wire. She lay there in the dark, the smell of cordite and burning hair thick in her throat. She tried to move her fingers. They worked, though they felt distant and numb, like they belonged to a mannequin. Her legs ached with a deep, throbbing pulse that matched the pounding in her skull. But they weren't broken. She was alive, but she was alone. The mountain had become her cage, and the silence was now her only ally. She could hear voices in the distance. They were harsh, rhythmic, not English. The insurgents were moving up the slope, their boots crunching on the loose scree with an arrogant confidence. They were looking for the remains of the Americans, hoping for trophies, weapons, or intelligence. Maya didn't panic. Panic is a biological traitor. Panic is a heartbeat increase. A heartbeat increase leads to heavy breathing. Heavy breathing in the sub-zero air leads to steam. A white plume that would give away her position instantly. She crawled deeper into the crack of the mountain, pressing her back against the freezing stone. She moved like a lizard, slow, deliberate, and silent. Her movements were measured in centimeters per minute, her breath controlled through gritted teeth. She didn't reach for her sidearm, knowing that one shot would bring 50 men down on her head. Instead, she reached for her spotting scope, the glass miraculously still intact in its padded case, though the housing was scorched. She was missing her radio, her team, and her primary rifle was buried under a foot of rubble at the impact site. But she still had her mission. A soldier doesn't stop being a soldier because the comms are down or the weapon is gone. The mission is an internal commitment, not an external order. For the next 4 hours, Maya Cole did what she was trained to do. She survived. She stayed in the freezing crevice, using her body heat to keep her core temperature from plummeting into hypothermia. She watched through the small gap in the rocks as the insurgent recovery team combed the area. She watched them point at the crater, laughing and kicking the debris where they thought her body was. They celebrated their victory over the ghost, assuming the fire had done their work for them. And then she saw what they were protecting. Below on Route Crimson, the valley floor began to rumble. This wasn't the usual light truck convoy of technicals and supplies. A massive column began to move under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, its headlights off, using the starlight to navigate. Not just trucks, but heavy equipment trailers. Maya adjusted her scope, her eyes straining through the blur of a concussion. She saw the distinctive canisters, pieces of an S-300 missile system. This wasn't a small supply run. This was a strategic move, a game changer that would give the insurgents the ability to deny the airspace over the entire province, grounding the very helicopters that were supposed to extract her. She pulled out her notepad, her fingers numb and clumsy. In the near-total darkness, using only the ambient starlight and the faint glow of the distant fires, she wrote down the serial numbers she could see, the markings, the timing of each vehicle, the direction of the lead Hilux. She memorized the faces of the officers through the glass, noting their rank and their weapons. Her head was thumping with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and her vision was swimming with static. But she didn't stop. Every time a soldier walked within 10 feet of her hiding spot, Maya held her breath until her lungs burned. She didn't think about the fire that had almost consumed her. She didn't think about her team retreating, thinking she was a charred memory. She thought about the data. She thought about the pilots who would be shot down, the Black Hawk Down scenarios that would play out if this convoy reached its destination. She was the only witness. Patience isn't just waiting. It's waiting with a purpose. It's the ability to suppress the animal instinct to run and replace it with the cold, mechanical logic of the mission. It is the victory of the mind over the body's fear. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the true cold began to set in, the dead hour where the temperature drops to 15 degrees below zero. Maya's hands were a waxy gray, her lips a deep bruised blue. The pain in her chest from the pressure wave was a sharp stabbing knife every time she inhaled. But she didn't move. She waited for the perfect moment, the moment when the enemy's attention would shift to the morning prayers, the moment when the long, distorted shadows of the peaks would be deep enough to hide a moving ghost. She began her climb. Not down the mountain to the safety of the valley floor, where the enemy was thickest, but back up, back to the highest ridge, right through the remains of her own death. She needed the elevation to signal. She needed to be seen by the right people at the right time. If you realize survival sometimes means patience, type, I was wrong. At the secondary rally point, 2 miles away, the recon team was a mess of guilt and quiet desperation. Miller sat against a frost-covered rock, staring at the empty horizon through his spotting scope. He hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She didn't even have a chance to fire a shot, he muttered to Harris, his voice trembling with the realization of his own previous arrogance. We were so loud and she was so quiet, and now she's just gone. It doesn't feel right, Sergeant. We shouldn't have left. Sergeant Harris was looking through his long-range optics, his face a grim mask of military necessity. We pull out at 0500. We've lost our observation post, our comms are shaky, and the enemy knows we're here. The mission is a failure, Miller. We report the loss of 1-6 and we head back to base. We can't help her if she's dead, and we can't stay here to die with her. Wait, Miller said, his voice jumping an octave as he adjusted the focus on his lens. He was squinting as the first blood-red light of dawn began to bleed over the jagged, obsidian peaks. I see something, on the ridge, right at the impact site. Something's moving in the smoke. Harris snapped his binoculars up, his jaw tight. Through the morning haze and the lingering, acrid smoke of the blast, a figure appeared. It wasn't an insurgent. The silhouette was wrong, no robes, no AK-47 slung carelessly. The movement wasn't the casual stroll of a victor. It was the fluid, tactical, low-profile movement of a professional. A ghost returning to the scene of the crime. "Is that a ghost?" Miller whispered, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Harris, nobody survived that blast. We saw the fireball. We saw the rock slide. It's impossible." The figure stopped on the highest point of the ridge, the rising sun silhouetting a slender, jagged frame. The ghillie suit was tattered, hanging in burnt blackened strips, making her look more like a mountain spirit or a vengeful wraith than a soldier. The figure raised a hand, the movement slow, deliberate, and perfectly clear against the orange sky. 2 fingers up, a sharp chop to the left, a closed fist. "That's Cole," Harris breathed, a wide, disbelieving grin breaking across his face for the first time in years. "That's her. That's a tactical signal for enemy convoy, northwest static. She's still on mission. She never stopped." They watched in stunned silence as Maya Cole moved down the ridge toward them. She didn't run. She moved with a limping, steady pace that commanded the mountain, her boots finding purchase on shale that would have tripped any other soldier. She didn't look like a hero from a movie when she finally reached the rally point. She looked like she had been buried alive and had to dig her way out with her fingernails. Her face was caked in gray dust. Her eyes were bloodshot from the concussion and the lack of oxygen, and her hands were stained with a mixture of blood, soot, and frozen grit. She didn't wait for a welcome back. She didn't ask for water, food, or a medic, even though her left shoulder was clearly dislocated and hanging at a sickening angle. She pulled the crumpled, sweat-stained notepad from her pocket and handed it to Harris with a hand that shook only slightly. "They have the S-300 components," Maya said, her voice a raspy, dry whisper that sounded like stones grinding together in a dry well. 3 launchers, 6 support vehicles. They're hidden in the cave system at grid 4, 4-9 to avoid thermal detection during the day. They move again at sunset. If we don't hit them now, the air corridor is closed for good. The mission isn't over." The team stood in a heavy, humbled silence. They had spent the night grieving and planning a retreat, wallowing in the failure of their own expectations. Maya had spent the night 6 feet from the enemy's boots, her lungs full of dust and her body broken, gathering the exact intelligence required to win the entire campaign. "Staff Sergeant," Miller stepped forward, his head low, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of his earlier words about her being dead weight felt like lead in his stomach. We thought the fire took you. We were going to leave. I thought you were gone." Maya looked at him, really looked at him. The exhaustion in her eyes was tempered by a cold, crystalline clarity that made him feel like he was being scanned by a laser. "The fire didn't take me, Miller. It just gave me a better place to hide. The smoke masked my movement when they came to check the crater. Now stop talking. We have a convoy to intercept. Radio the coordinates to the strike package. Now." Shrieking, for the next hour Maya sat in the dirt, refusing to lie down until the airstrike was confirmed. She cleaned her backup rifle with a mechanical, obsessive focus, her movements a blur of professional habit. She didn't brag. She didn't tell a grand story about her survival. She simply gave the coordinates to the air support and watched as the gray silhouettes of the jets roared overhead 10 minutes later, their ordnance finishing the job she had started in the dark. She had been underestimated because she was quiet. She had been counted as dead because they didn't understand the depth of her discipline. But as the distant rolling explosions echoed from the cave system, the team realized that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield wasn't the one that made the most noise. It was the one that knew how to wait for the light. It was the quiet professional who never lost sight of the goal. If you believe calm thinking under pressure makes the difference, type "I owe you." The extraction helicopter arrived at 0900. The wind from the rotors kicked up the dust of the ridge, a final, biting reminder of the blast that should have killed her. The team worked in a new kind of silence, a silence born of profound respect and the uncomfortable realization of their own short-sightedness. As the team loaded into the vibrating belly of the bird, there was a new energy. The mission wasn't just a success, It was a total strategic victory. They had prevented a shift in the war's power balance, all because one person refused to stay dead when the world became fire. They were no longer just a team. They were witnesses to something greater than themselves. Miller sat across from Maya. He watched her as she leaned her head against the vibrating hull of the Black Hawk, her eyes closed. She looked small in her gear, frail even, with the dust making her skin look like ancient parchment. He watched her hands, those steady, scarred hands, and realized that he had been looking at the wrong things the entire mission. He had been looking for strength in noise and muscle, but he found it in silence and endurance. "Staff Sergeant," Miller shouted over the deafening roar of the engines and the whine of the rotors. "I'm sorry for what I said on the climb up. About you just lying there. I didn't get it. I was wrong. I was arrogant." Maya opened one eye and gave a small, tired nod. She didn't need the apology, but she accepted it as a necessary part of his growth. The mountain doesn't care about your effort, Miller. It doesn't care about how much you sweat, how many miles you hike, or how loud you yell. It only cares about your result. You learn that eventually, or you don't come back at all. The mission is the only thing that survives. When they landed back at the forward operating base, there were no cameras. There was no grand medal ceremony on the tarmac. There was just a debriefing room, a lot of cold, bitter coffee, and a mountain of paperwork. The high-level intelligence officers were ecstatic, but to Maya it was just the end of a very long, very painful day. The commander of the task force walked into the room. He looked at the detailed sketches Maya had made in the dark. He looked at the photos she had taken with her spotting scope before the climb back. He looked at her tattered ghillie suit, which was now being held together by duct tape and sheer will. He had seen thousands of soldiers, but he had never seen a report like this. "Sergeant Cole," the commander said, his voice filled with a rare, hushed respect that silenced the room. Most soldiers would have run for the hills the moment that drone hit. Most would have focused purely on survival. "Why did you stay in that fissure for 4 hours with the enemy walking on top of you? Why climb back up?" Maya looked at the topographic map on the wall, her gaze distant and analytical. "I was already in position, sir. It would have been a waste of a very long walk to leave without the intel. Survival is part of the job description, but it isn't the mission. The ridge was still the best vantage point." The room chuckled, but it was a respectful, somber sound. They understood now. Maya Cole wasn't a super soldier who could fight off 50 men with a knife. She was something much more valuable. She was a professional who understood that her ego and her safety were secondary to the objective. She was the anchor that held the mission together when everything else drifted. The story of the ghost of the ridge spread through the base like wildfire, but Maya never told it herself. She didn't have to. The soldiers who had been on that mountain did the talking for her. They told the story of the woman who returned from the fire to finish what she started. They told the story of the silence that saved the province. Miller never made another joke about snipers. In fact, he started asking Maya for advice on observation, patience, and mental fortitude. He realized that the loudest soldiers were often the ones who broke first under the grinding pressure of the unknown. The quiet ones. The ones like Maya. They were the ones who held the world together when the fire started falling. They were the ones who saw the truth through the smoke. If you believe experience and discipline deserve respect, type, "I will live with honor." In the military, we focus on the flash. We focus on the firepower, the technology, the aggressive breach, and the loud kinetic action. We train for the roar of the battle. But the truth of the battlefield and the truth of life is often much quieter, much more subtle, and far more demanding of the soul. Success is rarely a Hollywood moment of explosive glory. It is the result of thousands of hours of unseen, unglamorous discipline. It is the ability to stay perfectly still when every nerve in your body is screaming for you to run. It is the patience to wait for the dawn when you are surrounded by nothing but darkness and the smell of your own fear. It is the victory of the mission over the self. Maya Cole didn't survive because she was lucky, though luck played its part in the rocks. She survived because she had mastered herself before she ever mastered the rifle. She understood that a weapon is only as good as the mind behind it, and a soldier is only as strong as their discipline. She knew that the fire was just a variable in a complex tactical equation. She knew that her isolation was just a condition of the terrain. By removing her ego and her fear from the calculation, she was able to see the tactical path that everyone else missed because they were too busy feeling the heat and hearing the noise. In our world today, we are surrounded by noise. Everyone wants to be heard. Everyone wants to be the hero of their own loud, chaotic story. But the real power, the true influence, and the ultimate success belong to the quiet professionals. The ones who solve the hardest problems without needing a thank you, a headline, or a spotlight. The ones who return to the ridge when everyone else has given up. Maya Cole is just a sniper. She is just a soldier doing her job in a cold, unforgiving place. But in that just, there is a greatness that changes the course of wars and the hearts of men. It is the greatness of the calm mind. It is the strength of the quiet observer. Always remember, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. The calmest mind on the ridge is the one that wins. The ghost always sees what the fire hides. If you believe the quiet professionals who solve the hardest problems deserve recognition, leave a comment and subscribe to the Veteran Story. We tell the stories behind the calm minds that change everything.